First, welcome everyone to the Melbourne School of Government's Disruptive Ideas Seminar. My name's Timothy Kariotis. I'm a Research Fellow in Regulation and Design, and today I'm joined by independent member for Warringah, Zali Steggall. Thank you for joining us, Zali.
My pleasure.
I want to start today's seminar by just acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations, the Wurundjeri people whose land I'm working on at the moment. And pay my respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that this is stolen land and that sovereignty was never ceded. Today we're going to be discussing policy making in a crisis, and part of that will be discussing climate change policy. And I also want to acknowledge that the climate crisis does disproportionately impact First Nations people across the world. So thank you all for coming. Welcome to our small community at the Melbourne School of Government. Today's event is being recorded, so just to acknowledge that, and it will be available on the Melbourne School of Government website post the event. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and our wonderful team behind the scenes will make sure to moderate those so that we can answer the most popular questions today. And if your question isn't answered, I'm sorry, but we'll try our best. So as I said, today I'm joined by Zali Steggall. I'm actually really excited about this conversation because I watched Q&A on Monday night and I think they're a bit fangirl here. So Zali is the independent federal member for the seat of Warringah, but she's also Australia's most successful alpine skier, which I was really shocked to find out about as someone who doesn't follow sport that closely. And from 2008, Zali was a practicing barrister specialising in commercial law, sports law and family law. Many of you will remember, only just over a year ago, Zali contested the federal parliamentary seat of Warringah, and that seat had been held for nearly 25 years by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Zali won the seat with a two-candidate preferred vote of 57.24%, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking with you today, Zali. And I want to ask you a question that I've asked so many people over the last few months. How are you going in this crisis?
Look, I feel incredibly lucky because for me, I've got employment security. I live in an area where we have very good healthcare services. So I feel incredibly lucky, and I know for so many it's been a lot harder. I've been incredibly proud of our community. I think here locally for us in Warringah, we've responded well to the directives in terms of the social distancing and implementing all those measures. But also we've seen a really good engagement from local government, really proactive local councils in terms of working with local businesses and the community around restrictions. I mean, part of my electorate, we have Manly Beach, which is a pretty popular place to hang out. So it took some work for people to change those habits. We're a very active community. Manly Beach, Balmoral Beach, they're a little harder to take out of your everyday life. So from our point of view, really good, but also working with local governments, state MPs and the federal government at making sure our community is informed, that they know what's happening, but also, the increase in provision of health services, making sure we're prepared. I think the government has done a really good job. Both state government and federal government have done a really good job at that, and we really need to note that.
Definitely, and I think our local governments sometimes get lost in the equation, but they're working so hard to provide those frontline services. Now, many of us are working from home or in completely redesigned workplaces to deal with social distancing. You as a politician, you're expected to still be in Canberra to hold the government to account. How have you managed that with the social distancing measures and obviously following all the public health directives?
Yeah, look, it was tricky because one of the first things we actually had to do was change the sitting schedule for Parliament, for Canberra. So I was due, we were back there on 23rd of March, is when our normal sitting calendar essentially got changed, and that was quite controversial. So there was a very split reaction on social media around the fact that we essentially, it was interpreted as a suspension of Parliament, because what had to happen was, just as you had to put in place social distancing measures for businesses and communities, clearly Parliament is people coming together from every corner of Australia, 151 MPs in the lower house, coming together with their staff into one nice little, petri dish of Parliament House, and then going back to their communities. So it wasn't realistic that we all continue to sit in Parliament in a traditional way and still stop the spread of the virus. So it was important that the government suspend the normal sitting schedule. We put in place certain measures, and we went back to Parliament on 2 occasions for 1 day for kind of an exceptional sitting where we dealt with urgent legislation relating to the crisis. But look, that was, a lot of people were unhappy with that because they felt that that was essentially a suspension of Parliament, a loss of scrutiny over what the government was doing and how it was responding to the crisis. And I appreciate that, but you have to balance it with the practical measures of, I also have a responsibility to my staff and my community, and I couldn't just expose them. You know, we can't ignore the social distancing measures required. So I felt the balance was right in terms of suspending Parliament, in terms of the normal sitting schedule, having special days. We had limited MPs attend Parliament, so there were about 40 pairs between Labor and Coalition. So it was really only MPs that could drive down and were probably not in an age category that was at risk that could attend. So it was a limited form of debate. But still really important to have scrutiny on what the government implements in these kind of times of crisis. So there was a push for the Senate inquiry to review the measures the government puts into place, and that's a really important step. It's actually sitting today. We saw the government implement the National COVID Coordination Commission, and that again didn't really have transparency and scrutiny. So the Senate inquiry is putting some scrutiny around that, but I think more needs to be done. So yes, Parliament and governance changes in a period of crisis, but the key is finding that right balance. But my job is not just Canberra, and I think that's where, you know, as an MP, I spend about 20 to 22 weeks where we're down in Canberra, but the rest is up here, and the work actually during this period was in the local community. We had a huge number of emails and phone calls of people very distressed, needing to know how the measures the government was announcing were going to impact them. Could they access it? But also helping them deal with departments. We had a huge number of local residents stuck overseas when the borders were closed, or family members needing assistance to come home. So a lot of our work was actually informing the community. We did a number of like DLs, and we did things, a lot of things that we had to get out to the community to make sure they knew what was going on, especially older members of the community who don't have smartphones and can't download the apps and all those things. They needed to be really, liaised with, so a lot of phone calls and letterbox drops.
I can imagine the challenge, especially when it's such a rapid moving situation. How did you and your team, I guess, manage the dynamic nature of the situation where advice could change from day to day?
Absolutely. And what's really, I think being an independent, we are very flexible. So we're like a small business. My team are all really fantastic professionals in messaging and trying to sort of, making sure we can get the information out. So we had a constantly update of the website and regular posts. We started doing zooming in sessions with experts to give content and to replace what would have normally been a community forum where people could come and raise issues with me. So you had to adapt your model of engaging with the community to an online model. But whereas, and I think as an independent, I had that flexibility that we could, as a team, we could meet, we could decide on a strategy and implement. We don't have to go through a party structure that approves a process or a message. So I think in that sense, I could really respond to the local need. We had, to give you an idea, in my first year, we've had over 16,000 emails from constituents and people around Australia wanting to raise an issue with me or with concerns, people that need help with their NDIS plans or dealing with Centrelink or visa applications. So, there's a real customer service aspect of representing the community.
That's it sounds overwhelming in one sense, but it is, as you said, it's a big part of the role of being a politician outside of being in Canberra.
Yeah.
I know that for the first few weeks of the crisis or the pandemic, my eyes were glued to the news. I had ABC News running 24/7, and it did feel quite overwhelming. But you and other politicians have still pushed for other policy discussions to continue in this time. And one of the key ones I think of is climate change policy. At what point did you decide, I still need to focus on this, even though there's this other crisis going on?
Yeah, look, to me, it was a bit reminiscent of during the bushfire crisis, where we had the government saying, well, look, we can't talk about climate change. We're focused on the crisis. Look, I think realistically, as politicians, as representatives of community, we've got to be in the conversation from a policy making point of view, and good policy is long-term policy that takes into account a lot of factors. I think you start making mistakes when you get into reactive short-term policy, because you don't think through all the consequences. We saw that with some of the mistakes made. So I think it is our role to, yes, we have to be preoccupied on the job at hand, but you always have to have an eye on the future and how the decisions you make today will impact tomorrow, because that's a part of life. So very important, as we were dealing with the health emergency at first, what the long-term implications of that were, but very, very quickly, simultaneously, we had to also focus on the economic crisis that was developing as we had the shutdown measures and businesses being told they had to be closed. And so automatically, hand in hand with an economic crisis, is how do we come out of the economic crisis? We may not know exactly when we come out of it, but at some point we have to rebuild out of it. And that's where we have to have that focus on what should that rebuild look like? What is going to be bang for buck? We need to make sure public money is invested for long-term good, and we need to make sure it's on merit. So as we talk about technologies and where stimulus should be, it's really important that we do it on merit, so that that long-term business case stacks up. So yeah, I think as a representative, it's my job to make sure I've got my eye on a number of things. That's why we have a good team. That's why there are so many good think tanks out there in the community that are coming up with the data and really looking at what all our options are.
I think you've made some really key points there around this long-term thinking. But I guess for many people in our community, and also in the media, there's a bit of a we need to survive. How have you found space to have these conversations in both the media but also in your local community?
Well, look, people are really keen to have the conversation. So sure, for the first couple of weeks, the immediate focus was the health concern. Are we immediately at risk? What do we need to do? How do we ensure our safety? But then as that, it's that fight or flight kind of reflex to a crisis. As we develop our strategy to cope, and most people had to adjust their lifestyle or their work or kids staying home, all those aspects, you settle into, your level of alarm drops, and then you have to, you then start having that capacity to deal with more issues. And so we found that a lot of people, as they worked out their new normal, they were able to then say, okay, well, I've got time, I've been reading on this topic, or I've been looking at it. What's the next thing I really want you to be focused on? So we did find there was a big appetite for it in the community. But also, this whole change to more online conversations. So being able to do Zoom, webinars and meetings means all of a sudden we can have conversations which might have taken a month to line up, and I would have had to fly somewhere and get everyone in the room together. We've all of a sudden all accepted that this is a much more convenient way of doing things, which is, I think, really interesting. So I've had the opportunity to have some really interesting webinars with Peers of the Planet, which is like a political groups from the House of Lords and the UK Parliament, and from experts around the world on topics which we probably in the past would have felt more constrained by the need to have physical engagement. So I think it's been a really interesting learning curve, and I hope we take a lot out of this period and keep going.
Yeah, and even though I think we would love to invite you to Melbourne, it sounds like the weather's a bit nicer in Manly at the moment. So this is a great situation.
Well, look, it also, I think it's maybe it's a little window into people's how they operate, but I think we've all adapted to it quite well. It provides more flexibility, which is, I think, quite interesting. Time is always an issue for me. My diary gets full pretty quickly, but by making I've had constituent meetings over Zoom with community groups, and because it doesn't involve traveling somewhere, being there, we've been able to fit a lot more in. So I think it's been a really interesting learning curve.
I want to pivot a bit, and I feel like pivoting has become the word of the year.
Keyword.
I guess, what happens after the crisis. There seems to be two main narratives in the political sphere right now when it comes to the question of what happens after COVID. Some are arguing that we need to snap back to normal, while others are arguing this is a pivotal point for Australia to reimagine how it organises its economy and society. And nowhere is this discussion more pertinent than the climate crisis. How do you see the COVID-19 recovery linking to climate change policy, and specifically the climate change bill that you proposed to introduce to Parliament earlier this year?
Yeah, look, I think the Prime Minister, when the crisis started, was talking about what the snapback would look like, but I think that was probably more marketing terms, because I don't think he even would have known where things were heading. So he was talking about a 6 months kind of hibernation period. So clearly, but I do feel that the conversation has moved on from that option. I think we all acknowledge it's going to take something else. That the lay of the land has changed. I mean, you've got in Europe, the EU announcing a 750 billion euro package towards recovery and stimulus, but focused on decarbonisation and low emission technologies. So there's a clear direction from the world in terms of where our rebuild and focus has to be. Also, during this crisis, we've seen in Australia, we've identified, I think, where we're a bit exposed, some weak points. So looking at our supply lines, have we, from an export point of view in our markets, have we been too focused on certain markets and not diversified enough? And do we have enough local manufacturing of essential items? So I think that's really a great opportunity for repositioning and pivoting, as you say, certain aspects. So clearly we're not going to go back to the old way of doing things. We have to go to a new and better. I think, modern technology, modern societies, we should always be looking at how do we do it better. We don't go back to something that wasn't working great. So great opportunity for us to look at that. What does that look like? I think what we saw through the virus was a bipartisan approach to, in time of crisis, we should all, you put aside your differences and we work towards the common goal of everyone being safe and, a better community. So I think we do, well, hopefully, and I'll be advocating for holding on to this, we all together need to advocate for a prosperous, safe Australia in the future. And what does that look like? What are the things we need to all agree on? And that, I think, should be an agreement in terms of technology on merit, that we need to look at the best business plan, the best case for what we do, what kind of markets will there be. So when we look at manufacturing and industry, we need to make sure that manufacturing and industry will be appropriate for a world market and will be appealing. So then really important as we look at merit, that it's going to tick all those boxes. So I think there is great opportunity, and I don't think the snapback is really a scenario anyone's acknowledging or talking about too much now. Everyone acknowledges it's going to be something more, something different. And now the key is to create, I think, that bipartisan approach to a more positive outlook.
And on the topic of climate change and the climate crisis. I know that the policy that you, or the bill that you were taking to the House, was a framework legislation to set out some, I guess, key goals that other policies should align to. Is that still the direction you're hoping to go in, or do you see that there's probably some more specific policies that could be proposed alongside that as we start to look at the recovery?
No, absolutely. So I was due to present the climate change bill on the 23rd of March. So clearly I had to withdraw that. And since what we've had Climate Works has released a report. I believe Beyond Zero Emissions are releasing a million job plan today around renewables. We've had the government release its technology roadmap. So we've had some pieces of the puzzle released, I think, in the last couple of months that help make the plan to our carbon neutral future. But what we're missing in all these pieces of the puzzle is actually to legislate the framework and the commitment to where we're heading. What is our goal? Now, the goal is clearly carbon neutrality, and we need to set that, because there's no way the private sector is going to have the incentive to invest in these technologies unless we can give it certainty that there's a goal that's intended to be achieved, that this isn't going to go off in another direction. We need to keep the foot on the accelerator per se, and only a goal will do that. So what I've done with the climate change bill is I've included some sections, for example, in relation to the government's technology roadmap, so that it acknowledges that the roadmap looks at our technology readiness and an assessment of what technology there is and how it will deliver in certain sectors. But it's not the full picture. We still need our risk assessment from a climate impacts and an emissions point of view across all sectors and industry. And we still need a risk management. At the same time as all this is happening, we have the Royal Commission into the bushfires and our emergency crisis response. We've seen some horrendous facts come from that, in terms of fatalities from smoke inhalation, over 3,000 admissions to hospital for smoke-related concerns. So clearly that health impact is there. So the bill provides the commitment to carbon neutrality. So it's really important that people understand that too, because it's amazing how many people think net zero is no emissions. That's not realistic. Realistically, industry, we're still always going to have emissions. But what we need to do is commit to balancing the budget. We need to balance our carbon budget, and that means carbon neutrality, and that's net zero. So lock that into legislation by 2050, which is what's required to stay under 2 degrees of warming. How do you achieve that? Then you have 5-year emission budget periods to just give that clear roadmap and planning to get to that goal. You then also have a climate change commission under the bill. And now we've seen with the government was quite happy to embrace a Corona Coordination Commission, again, looking at bringing experts together to put together a plan and recommendations or advice to government on how to deliver, stated goals. So this is not a foreign concept. Just to do it around climate, I think you need to take into account a few more skills. We need to have regional equity. We need to have generational equity. We need to ensure food and water security. So there's a few more elements that I think we need around the table for a climate change commission. And clearly we need climate scientists and experts. And then the risk assessment and the risk management. So I will be I'm going to be releasing shortly a draft, an updated draft of the climate change bill, taking into account the current scenario for consultation, with a view to presenting it to Parliament a little bit later in the year. We've got the Royal Commission, we've got the budget, we've got a few things, we need some clear air to put it forward. And I want to have the time for consultation. I think it's really important people understand what the climate change bill does, why it's important and why it's needed to provide that legislative framework over the roadmap.
That's really exciting. And I'm really excited because I think the fact that it isn't getting into the game of politics is an exciting approach to take to lay that groundwork. We know you mentioned, I guess, accountability earlier on, specifically mentioning the COVID-19 Recovery Committee, and they've suggested gas as potentially the future of our green economy. How do you see all of this fitting together, that narrative around accountability of that committee, but also around the narrative they're feeding into our post-COVID climate change recovery?
Yeah, look, I think the problem is at the moment we have the National Coronavirus Coordination Commission is a hand-picked group of individuals by the Prime Minister to advise and coordinate on our recovery. Now, all of the people on that body are eminent, experienced, very impressive people. But there is an overwhelming imbalance in terms of where their expertise comes from. And if the goal is to assist all of Australia and all of society in its recovery, you need to have all the opinions around the table, and you need to be really clear about what are the key guiding principles decisions have to be checked against. So what are the priorities of the Commission, and how do we check that they are staying true to those principles? And for that, that's a question of transparency, and it's a question of governance. At the moment, there is no public hearings in relation to how that Commission receives information. There's no guidelines around what are the principles a project needs to, what are the parameters? How do you assess the KPI of something being put to them? How does it become a valid project for recommendation? Now, there is no clarity around that. So what I'm calling for is clarity. So we need some key principles, and I would suggest generational equity, a merit system on technology, that all projects need to be towards our long-term Paris Agreement commitment. So they need to be towards reducing our emissions. So there must be an acknowledgement of a disclosure of carbon risk relating to projects or technologies that are being put forward. So I think that's a really important part of the model. And where my concern, I guess, is multiplied is through this period we've also had the King Review. Now the King Review has been a hand-picked body led by Grant King by the Minister to do a review of how the government's safeguard mechanism policy has worked. Again, there's been a heavy focus on carbon capture and storage and gas, so there's a bit of concern again there. And it was completely avoiding the Climate Change Authority. So, it feels a bit like you're picking your body of who you want to listen to. And then there's also, through the roadmap, a ministerial reference panel, which is the same people, again, nominated already to this panel. From my inquiries, there was no consultation, there was no public process by which people could, be nominated or put to this panel. I understand some very eminent people that I would have thought should be on that panel are not. I think of someone like Mike Cannon-Brooks, who does amazing things. Why is he not on a ministerial reference panel for our energy future? So there's a lot of questions around that transparency and governance that at the moment I don't think the Prime Minister and the government are satisfactorily dealing with.
We've actually just had a question come through, which I think in a way touches on this, in that it does appear that depending whatever political party is in power, they tend to put forward committees that sometimes support their views. And Kevin asks that, you said we need a bipartisan approach. Are you seeing evidence of those old divisions shaking? And, is it potentially a pathway forward that hopefully some of these challenges around openness and accountability can be addressed through this crisis?
Well, I think we've been able to come together in a more bipartisan way for the crisis. And in times of emergency, we generally do as a society. I think it's acknowledging that we have a task at hand to evolve our economy, our jobs, our energy, to a low carbon emission world. When I was speaking to some politicians from the UK, they very much saw their climate change, because the climate change bill is copied off and very much based off legislation in the UK, and they were part of the original team putting it together, and they were very much talking about that it decouples economic growth from emissions, and it's a really important part of our future. So it's very much, and that is something that was achieved on a bipartisan basis there, and it needs to be achieved here. I believe there's data coming out today saying, you know, overwhelming number of Australian voters for both the Coalition and Labor want to see a low emission focused stimulus and recovery. So I think the mandate is there for that to be the focus from government. Do people return to old party lines and you know, stacking of commissions and stuff like that? Of course it happens, and people have, you know, their networks, but I think it's really important we focus on that merit system of what we look at and who do we put around the table. And I think that's where we need to broaden from just the current focus on gas, because does gas stack up on a merit assessment as a technology for the future? It's where we have, you know, we have the AEMO, so the Australian Energy Market Operator has done an assessment of all our needs from an energy basis. It's called the Integrated Systems Plan. It's looked at 3 different scenarios, and it's made it really clear that we have the potential and the capacity to get to 74 to 94% renewables. So with only about a 1% gas in the mix. So it really begs the question is, you know, that if we're going to do a merit-based assessment of technology, we're going to have to look broader than just gas projects. So for that to happen, you need people from all backgrounds around the table. So I would like to see the government add to the NCCC and the Ministerial Reference Panel people with background, with other expertise.
We've got lots of questions coming through on this, but I've got one more question to ask, and I want to give people a little bit more time to get all their questions in and for our team to collate them. COVID-19 in a way is a weird crisis because it's a shared global experience, and we don't have many of these shared global experiences, but we're also disconnected from the rest of the world like we've never been before. The political sphere has always been a bit fractional of this, but also the public sphere. Do you think that this shared global experience and this narrative around climate change being a shared global issue, which we haven't really had since the 80s and 90s climate conferences, where it was kind of seen as a shared global issue, usually tied to environmentalism rather than climate change as a specific entity. Do you think this is going to change the public narrative and maybe start to refocus the issue about the impact on our neighbours, such as in the Pacific Islands as well?
Yeah, look, it's been really interesting. I mean, if the coronavirus crisis has shown anything, is we are all part of a global network, and anything that happens around the world will impact us. We are not immune to what happens. So clearly, just as a pandemic will reach our shores, climate impacts will impact us. And we all know from, you know, the Paris Agreement, from IPCC, it's going to take global action. The irony is that the denier voices for action in Australia have always used this argument that we're just a small part of what the rest of the world is doing. So what difference can we possibly do to the big picture? Just ignoring that idea that, you know, every 1% counts and adds up clearly. And ironically, we are not a small contributor, we are a large contributor. So it's really important to know that. You know, I think we're the 14th highest in the world. So that is high on a per capita basis. So, but what's been interesting with the crisis is we've been able, as an island nation, to lock our borders and have a very effective policy to flatten the curve from a health crisis point of view. So it's been really interesting that it shows strong local action is really effective on the crisis at hand. So I would argue when it comes to our climate action, we have that capacity to, you know, the crisis has reminded us that we are going to be impacted by what happens around the world. So the idea that business as usual, we can go on doing our thing, will be fine, she'll be right. It doesn't wash. We have to contribute, and we have to encourage. We have to do our bit, but we have to encourage other nations to do it as well. But we also have the potential to make a difference locally. So what we do matters. So we can evolve away from coal generated, coal powered stations, and health impacts locally, for example. So it has been really interesting what the crisis has done to the messaging. I think it's going to evolve. We've appreciated being better connected with what happens around the world. And how, I think it's become more real. The biggest issue, climate, raising awareness to climate impacts and consequences for people, is it's being perceived, I think, as a problem for down the road. It's a problem for in 10, 15 years' time. Look, I've got a more immediate problem now, I will worry about it later. I think it's human behaviour, is we tend to put something off until we're really facing the crisis. What's been interesting about 2020 is we've had a horrendous summer of bushfires where communities are having to be evacuated. A very real, reminder or experience that this is happening now. We have very real advice from many aspects about this is not a one-off. It's unprecedented, but it's not unique. We will get it again. We've had terrible air pollution. We've now had a health pandemic. We are in it now. This is not a problem for in 10 years' time. This is a problem for now, and we have to grapple with it. So just as Australians have learnt to, we flattened the curve on the pandemic, we need to flatten the curve on our emissions. And just as we talked about in the coronavirus crisis of, if we have a high spike, it creates, it has a domino effect on our society, on our health entity capabilities, so will climate impacts. And so we need to flatten that curve. And as we've seen with the data, the longer, flatter the curve we can make it, the more manageable it is. If we have to do an abrupt descent, it will be very costly and very difficult.
I have felt very positive about how empowered some of my friends have felt in this crisis, where they've probably never felt as empowered to have a stake in their community before. So hopefully we can see this carry over into climate change policy. And obviously climate is only one of the many challenges our country faces. And Cheryl has asked a question. She says, Parliament has many good policies to work on, but we have limited resources, budget, time, etc. Coming out from the COVID-19 crisis, which policies are prioritised to be the top three, and are they different to the pre-COVID-19 crisis?
Well, look, the parliamentary agenda is driven by the government. So, the coalition is in government. They have a certain agenda of what they're putting through. We haven't had a lot of legislation come through since the last election, really. And I think, to their credit, a lot of things will have changed. Maybe certain legislation that had a lot of focus before the crisis, I don't think is going to be as prominent now. We've already had announcements that some legislation's being abandoned in preference for other. I really welcome the unions and business sector working together for a better, trying to improve our working, getting rid of some of the issues we've had around efficiencies for business, agreements. I think it's really welcome that we could see business and unions working together for a more productive and more efficient system in the future. So I really welcome that. And I think that's a great opportunity that, let's make 2020 has been such a horrendous year. Let's make it a reset year. Let's really make it a year that stands out for good as we look back on it in years to come. So I'm really keen to see what agenda the government brings to the Parliament. I hope we can let go of, I think, negative legislation like the Religious Freedoms Bill, for example, which is very divisive, and really focus on more positive, productive legislation that will help us as a community be more prosperous, because we are, the Treasurer announced yesterday, we are, he said the recession word. We need to focus on that. I'm still very worried about the next quarter, what our employment figures are going to be. So I think we're going to need to focus legislation around that. I've been very concerned, we've got a review of the EPBC Act at the moment, that we don't wind back environmental protections. So we've had a lot of talk of, from industry saying, right, for an economic stimulus, let's wind back red and green tape so that manufacturing can kickstart. Again, I don't think that stacks up on a long-term merit review, as far as a policy. So I think it's really important that we keep an eye on those aspects. I think the government's priority will be legislation around, they've already indicated, around amending the mandate for the CEFC and ARENA, and I will be scrutinising that very closely, because again, I don't support the idea that we cut green tape for short-termism that will have long-term negative consequences. So I think it's an opportunity for interesting policy, but we need to keep an eye on exactly what the long-term consequences are.
We have time for one more question, and it's a question from Jane, which I think touches on some of the key points you've raised, but also some of the everyday stresses people are facing now. In the bushfire crisis, we had so many people speaking out that they were feeling anxious about their future, and now we have an economic crisis. Jane asks, for many people, the new normal consists of much more work done from home and online. Does this present new health policy challenges in relation to isolation and mental health? If so, what are the key challenges you foresee, and how can we be proactive in addressing them right now?
Yeah, look, the mental health concern is very real and, really very much on my mind, and I know it is on the government's mind. When I've met with the Prime Minister, mental health is a really big focus for him. There's no doubt this crisis, has exacerbated that, and I think we're only really just touching on it. I think the initial concern with health, and now we have the economic crisis and unemployment. So that will all snowball into a bigger mental health problem. So absolutely, how do we make sure that if we adapt for the better in terms of working from home and avoiding wasted commute time, that doesn't result in a loss of also downtime. So working from home has been interesting because it blurs into one, and you keeping those kind of delineated, home time and recreational time and work time, and not having it all blur into one, that you're not on call 24/7, never getting away from your work. So I think there's a bit more education and more awareness around that and how we manage it. And that has to be a focus. Social issues like housing are going to be big. Domestic violence has been a real concern through this period. So I think there's a lot of concerns on that front. I'm also concerned about it from a generational point of view. This health crisis has overwhelmingly targeted older Australians because that's been the demographic at risk from the virus. But consequences in terms of employment, housing, rental affordability, all those aspects are impacting the younger demographics, and they are also the generation that will pay for the stimulus through their working life, but they will also have to deal with climate impacts. So I really want to make sure the policies the government puts forward, I really want to keep a generational equity lens on it, that we really have to make sure that that's provided for. And our younger people are also the most at risk from a mental health point of view. So, we really have to be conscious that any policy has to have that long-term benefit.
as a young person, that is music to my ears. I'm really happy we've got advocates like you in Parliament pushing that perspective, because I know many of my friends and colleagues have been very severely impacted, and sometimes it's not the top media item. Even thinking about people having to take their super out and the long-term impacts of that is terrifying for some young people.
Yeah, but also it's really highlighted, you know, job seeker, job keeper, the gaps, you know, our gig economy, the amount of casual employment, what protections there are, how that's considered. It's, you know, arts and entertainment, hospitality, sectors that are huge employers, but with very little stability or protection. I think has been really eye-opening to see how much of our population is exposed. For young people, where are the industries of the future? You know, how do you plan? Our education facilities, universities are really going to have and they're going to have an ongoing problem, because not only have they missed this year as far as student intake, but that's going to be the second year, third year, fourth year students down the road. So a real problem for our universities and institutions. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into this to plan. So yeah, I mean, I'm a mother of a son doing year 12 this year, and he's looking at, you know, what's his future look like, and there's a lot of questions. So I'm very aware of those concerns.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Zali. This has been a conversation which has left me with a lot of hope, and there's not been a lot of hope in the last few months. So thank you for bringing that to our Thursday. I did want to ask you if you had, obviously, you've mentioned that obviously citizens have come out to flatten the curve, but there's so much more that needs to be done. Do you have any call for action for people on the webinar, watching the webinar, about ways they can get involved with their local community as we enter the recovery period of COVID-19?
Absolutely. You have to make your voice heard. I think being a passive bystander, hoping things will get better on their own, is not the way to go. You have to play a role, and you have to play a part. And so if you want a better society or different outcomes, you actually have to be engaged. One of the hardest things, you know, I find is engaging with our younger demographics, in terms of they tend to see politics as cynicism, don't see it as impacting them, and so don't engage with it. But yet you see, in a time of crisis, they should engage with it, because when decisions are made for, you know, JobKeeper and JobSeeker and packages, we see they are not geared towards those demographics. So I think, you know, it's really my call to arms for young people is get involved, be informed about the issues and how these things will impact your prospects and your life, and, you know, the responsibilities and things that are to come. It's really important that if you want a certain future, you're going to have to contribute and work towards it.
Thank you so much, Zali, for that call to arms. And I think I know lots of young people in my life who are so impassioned throughout the bushfire and this crisis to have their voice heard. To all of you on the call, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Sorry to those we couldn't answer. We'll be back here, or I'll be back here on the 23rd of June talking about the regulation of controversial medical products. So feel free to join us then. But right now, give a virtual round of applause for Zali for joining us, and have a really great Thursday. And thank you once again, Zali, for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.